they took her cancer cells and they put it in a petri dish. And interestingly enough, until then, the cancer cells that they put in petri dish didn't grow. They all died. But Henrietta's cancers, they just grew, doubled in every 24 hours. It was just amazing. So Henrietta's cells, they're called HeLa cells. HeLa, so Henrietta Lacks. So it's been used for polio vaccine. It's been used for a lot of different drug side effects and those kind of things. So those are cell studies. They take the cells, cancer cells from the patients, they put it in the petri dish, and then they do experiments on them, okay? Then there are animal studies. So when there is some evidence that these drugs or whatever they're doing to these cancer cells are working, then they test them in animals. And I don't believe in animal studies, but that's not a subject of this talk, because animals are so different than humans. So there are small animal studies like guinea pigs, mice, and those kind of things. And then there are primate studies, which, like monkeys, chimps, and those kind of things. And it's even the monkeys are very different than us, even though we evolved from them. So there are a lot of things, toxicities that are seen in humans, but not in animals, or they're seen in animals and not in humans. So FDA still asks for animal studies before a drug is tested in humans. We're hoping that a computerized form of humans will be eventually formed so that we can do experiments on them and not on animals. And then when you look at the human studies, there are 4 phases. You can have a drug approved after the 2nd phase if you have really good results, or you can have it approved after the 3rd phase. The 4th phase is just to look at the long-term side effects of patients on those drugs. So let's look at the preclinical studies. So the cell studies, we talked about cancer cells growing in a petri dish or in a test tube full of human or animal cancer cells, right? So those are the tests we talked about. Then the animal studies are, on live animals like mice, non-human primates. And then after even you do that, then the FDA is going to say, okay, I give you permission to test it in humans. So this is what is called an investigational new drug. It's called an IND application. So the company or the university, whoever wants to test this new drug in humans, they fill out this application, give it to the FDA with all the information. So the FDA looks at the preclinical information to look at what the animal studies showed. They check with the company to see, can they make all of these drugs for these patients? Is it safe? Is it stable? Then they go to the investigators and say, give me the protocol. How are you going to use this drug? Then the FDA looks at the clinical investigators like myself, and they say, well, does she have experience? Has she done this before? Does she have any bad behaviors? Like has she done experiments on humans that were not approved? And then it comes to the informed consent. So that's what the document I told you guys about. It's usually about anywhere between 20 to 40 pages. And they basically discuss, we tell the patients, here are how we're going to do this study, and this is the reason we're doing this study. And then the next step is you go to the institutional review board. It's called IRB. And these are a group of people in the university that are not related to that study, but they look at the whole study and say, are humans going to be harmed by this study? Are they looking into side effects and those kind of things? For example, I'm on the IRB as well, and we look at a lot of studies where there are volunteer studies. So we want to make sure that these volunteers that are coming in to get tested on, they're not going to be harmed. They're not going to have all of a sudden kidney failure or some other issue. So, and then the bottom line at the end, the FDA looks at everything and makes sure that, okay, yes, they have looked at everything. They're very careful. They're going to have stopping rules, which means if they are going to enroll 30 patients, are they going to look at the first 10 patients to see whether these 10 patients are doing okay, or are they all kind of having severe side effects? So FDA looks at that, and every now and then you have to update the FDA. FDA has the right to come in anytime they want and review all of our charts and make sure that patients are not being harmed and the study is being done correctly. Just to tell you about one incident about 25 years ago when I was a fellow, this person in South Africa, this doctor did a lot of research with bone marrow transplant for breast cancer patients. And I remember because there was this huge news and at our conferences that this doctor is able to cure metastatic breast cancer because of bone marrow transplant. So because all the other American people, researchers have done this study, and it was negative study, the FDA and all these people went over there. You know, they went over there, even though it was a different country, but investigators went there to see the charts, and it was a sham. I mean, there was no records kept. There was no, patients were not alive, even though they were saying they were alive. So I always warn my patients, please be careful when you go to other countries, because they don't have the FDA oversight, because they just give hope to patients and say, oh, we had a patient with metastatic leiomyosarcoma that was cured with this kind of weird bacterial injection. And I had a patient who went to Mexico and got bacteria injected in herself, and she almost died when she came back. She was septic, she had bacteria in all of her organs, and she had to pay $100,000. So please be careful when you go to these places, because they just don't have the oversight. And even though a lot of people hate the FDA, they're like, you know, but they have really good procedures in place to make sure patients are not harmed. But this whole procedure may cause some delaying in approval of drugs, but believe me, it is a good procedure that is in place. In terms of, now let's go into human studies. When we do human studies, as I said, there are 4 phases into the study. There's one, phase 1 is the initial study that the drugs are going to be tested. So this is like the first in-human study that, you know, it's a phase 1 study. So what we're doing with phase 1 studies is we're getting patients from all different types of cancers. So it's not particularly for sarcoma. It could be from breast cancer. You're putting all patients in who do not have good options otherwise. So, and the purpose of this is to see how toxic the drug is, whether patients can tolerate this new drug. And usually it's about 20 patients, and they start with low doses of the drug. And if 3 or 4 patients are doing well, then they go to the next level, then the next level, and then finally they go to the level that patients cannot tolerate anymore. Then they bring down the dose to the last level that patients were able to tolerate. So this is a phase 1 study, but remember, phase 1 studies are not horrible because they're putting all these patients from different cancers. I have to tell you a very interesting story, because in the 70s or late 60s, testicular cancer was not curable when they were stage 4. And at that time, testicular cancer, and even now, they're in young men that are under the age of 30, and these patients were dying. So there was a phase 1 study where they were checking the side effects of this drug called cisplatin. Cisplatin is a chemotherapy that was initially being used just for the first time in humans. It so happens that because there were not that many treatments for testicular cancer, several testis cancer patients enrolled in it. And these patients with testicular cancer that enrolled, 90% of them were cured. I mean, it was just amazing. It hasn't been seen since, you know. So then they figured out, well, this drug is really good for testis cancer. And now 90% of patients with testis cancer that have their tumors have spread to other parts of the organs are curable because of this phase 1 study. And as you know, Lance Armstrong also had testicular cancer. I don't know if you guys know him anymore. It was a long time ago, but he's a bicyclist. But he presented with brain tumor from his testis cancer, lung tumors, liver tumors, all of that stuff. And he was still able to be cured because he presented in the late 1990s. And that's when the cisplatin was already approved and patients were being treated. So don't think of phase 1 as just a study, a drug study that they're checking the side effects and they're trying to see how humans do with this study. There are some signals. So for example, there are a lot of phase 1 studies now ongoing that patients with sarcoma enroll in because they've tried other drugs and it didn't work. So they get into these phase 1 studies. And then at the end, when we look at the 20 patients, we say, okay, this is how the patients did. The drugs were safe. And then let's see, we have 3 patients with sarcoma. So maybe we should do a phase 2 study in 40 patients with sarcoma to see whether or not it really works. So that's when we go into our phase 2 study. The difference between phase 2 and phase 1 is you already know what dose to use. So you don't have to go at a lower dose and escalate and go up. You use the dose that you found it was safe in phase 1. And then you only put the same kind of cancer in a phase 2 study. So I give you an example of this. There was a phase 2 study in 2002 that was published and got a drug approved for sarcoma. It was for GI stromal tumors that previously, a long time ago, was confused with leiomyosarcoma because they're from kind of like a smooth muscle kind of area. So GI stromal tumors, or the other name for it is GIST, they did a phase 2 study where they tried Gleevec or imatinib, which is this little tiny pill that's targeted medicine. So these patients were taking these pills, and over 60% of patients responded, which was amazing because at that time we used to give chemotherapy to GIST patients, radiation, all this kind of stuff, and it never worked, and patients died within 6 months. So this phase 2 study, when the FDA looked at the results, they said, wow, this is great. We're going to get it approved. Let's have it available for all patients with GIST. And GIST patients now with stage 4 metastatic disease are alive 6 or 7 years later compared to like 6 months. So even with a phase 2 study, we can get drugs approved. So if you see some good results for the phase 2, but it's not enough for the FDA to say, yes, I'm going to approve it, then we go into a phase 3 study. So the phase 3 study is a little bit different, and some patients hate them because they may have to get placebo. So the phase 3 study is when they put hundreds of patients into this study, and we call it randomized, which means that half of the patients will get this new drug, and the other half of the patients get other things. The other things could be, standard treatment, right? So for example, let me give you an example of a phase 3 study. This is specifically for leiomyosarcoma. About 10 years ago or so, as all of you know, trabectedin or Yondelis is a chemotherapy that's been approved through a phase 3 study for leiomyosarcoma. And basically what they did was they gave some patients Yondelis, which was a new drug at that time, and the other patients got dacarbazine, which was at that time was a standard drug for leiomyosarcoma. So at the end, when the study was done, after hundreds of patients were enrolled, they found out that patients who take the Yondelis or the trabectedin chemotherapy, which was a new drug on the block, they actually have longer time before their tumor grows, okay? So basically, FDA said, oh, this is really good news. It's better than the standard chemotherapy, so let's get it approved. So that was one study where they compared it to standard treatment. Now, there are other studies that don't have, other cancers that don't have standard treatment, right? So they say, well, we want to see if this drug is better than placebo. And placebo just means a sugar pill, sham, or nothing, right? And an example of that kind of study in sarcoma is Votrient, pazopanib. I'm sure you guys have heard about that because it's a standard drug now for sarcoma, and it works beautifully in some Leiomyosarcoma patients. So in that particular study, half of the patients got the actual new drug, and the other half of the patients got placebo. And at the end of the day, they found out that patients that had the drug, the new drug, actually did better than patients who had the placebo. So FDA said, well, I'm going to approve it because it's better than nothing, right? So that's another example of a phase 3 study. Now, remember, placebo drugs are sometimes, it's kind of interesting because patients cannot get that drug, that new drug, without being on this study. So that's one good thing about these things. Just to tell you, I do not open placebo drugs at Stanford unless there is a crossover, which basically means patients come into the study, they either get the new drug or they get the placebo. If they get placebo and the cancer progresses, then the study allows them to get that study drug. So that means crossover. So if it doesn't work, you cross over to the active treatment. So those are the studies that I open at Stanford. I hate it when patients get teased and then they get, either the placebo or they get the placebo and they're not allowed to go get the actual drug when the cancer doesn't work. And there's a lot of researchers that don't develop those kind of studies anymore when patients don't have an option of getting the active treatment. So once they do this experimental treatment and the drug is better, then it goes to the FDA. So here's the process. You already did animal studies, you did phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and the drug is okay. Then you say, okay, let's go give this application to the FDA. And this is called a new drug application, so NDA. So all of this information is given to the FDA. You tell them that here's my results. The drug is better than the standard treatment. And the FDA will review the data and they say, okay, it's better, we approve it. Or they may say, well, it's not enough information. Go ahead and do another study. Just to give you an example of this, there was a phase 2 study that you guys may know about. It was adriamycin plus lartruvo in sarcoma patients, olaratumab. They did an early study with phase 2, and they randomized patients between adriamycin alone, which is also called doxorubicin, versus doxorubicin and this new drug lartruvo. They had about less than 100 patients in that study, and they got a good signal. And it was a very good signal where patients actually were living a year longer than patients who didn't get this new drug. So the FDA said, I'm going to approve it because I want to make it available to patients, but you're going to have to do a larger study. You have to do a phase 3 study to see if it really works. So I was excited about the drug because it was working. We thought a year, prolonging a year of patients' life, that's amazing. So once the phase 3 was done, we were all shocked because the study was negative and this new drug didn't work. So then the FDA said, well, it didn't work in a larger number of patients, I'm axing it. So they said, we're not approving it anymore. And that's really important because based on a small study, you're subjecting patients to a new drug that's not working. So, but the FDA saw the results were so good, they said, let's make it available. And it wasn't that toxic of a drug. It was very well tolerated. Maybe some of you have already taken it in the past. But when they did the larger study, it didn't work. So that's one of the things when the FDA says, I need more information. Now, what happens after you give this new drug application to the FDA? It usually takes about a year for the FDA to approve it. But because sarcomas are rare cancers, the maximum time that the FDA has by the time the company gives this application to them is 8 months, because sarcomas are very rare cancers. So it still takes about 8 months. Then the drug is available. Now, let me just tell you about phase 4 studies, just to be complete. Phase 4 study is when a drug is already approved by the FDA, and the FDA says, well, it's great, you know, you can have the drug, but let's do these long-term studies. Let's see in 20 years what's going to happen to the patient. Is the patient going to get another cancer in 20 years? We really need to see the safety of this drug long-term. So these are the phase 4 studies. It doesn't benefit the patient because it's such a long-term, you have to wait, but it kind of helps, you know, it helps other patients, you know, when they're coming along later on. Some phase 4 studies look at quality of life because they say, oh, FDA approved this drug, but patients are miserable and nobody wants to live like this. So they do this kind of study to evaluate the quality of life, to evaluate how much money is this poor patient paying for this drug. So these are phase 4 studies. It doesn't benefit the patient at the time, but it helps gather more information about the drug. So what is the benefit of you being on a trial? The benefit is you advance cancer research for us, right? For all other people. Also, it gives you access to a drug that you can't get otherwise. It may also increase the number of options that you have in terms of the treatment of the cancer. It also may have less side effects than the regular treatment that you are going to get, right? So that's another benefit. And also, believe me, when you're on a clinical trial, we monitor you like a hawk. We, you know, look at your blood tests, we examine you, we do all this kind of stuff to make sure you're healthy, you're safe, and nothing's happening. But some patients may think that's really a nuisance, you know, for us, calling patients, are you doing okay? Is anything going on? And also, one of the other benefits is that some studies pay for travel expenses. And the companies that do these studies, either universities or drug companies, they pay for patients traveling sometimes, and the hotel stays and meals and those kind of things. Not all studies do that, but you can ask the clinical trial director to see if they pay for that. Some of the bad things or possible risks for it is sometimes, you know, for phase 1, we don't know the side effects. So that's one of the risks. The other thing is, well, like any other treatment, the experimental treatment may not work, and you went through all this and it didn't work. And like I said before, you may have to see the doctor more frequently because we're monitoring you and we're making sure nothing else is going to happen. The other possible thing that could happen is you could get a placebo. So that's also another, you know, thing that could happen. And we talked about the crossover. Now, all insurance companies have to pay for standard of care studies that are being done. So for example, if you're getting a CT scan on a clinical trial and you were going to get the CT scan anyway, your insurance has to pay for it. But if the clinical trial says, well, instead of every 3 months, I want to do every 4-month CT scans, and your insurance says that's crazy, the clinical trial study will pay for it because they're monitoring you because of the clinical trial, and it's not standard of care. So anytime you're on a clinical trial, they do anything that's not standard of care, the company that's doing the trial will pay for it. But otherwise, the co-pays for visits and those kind of things, it's the patient responsibility. Now, where to go to find clinical trials? This is the best. There are a lot of different websites, but all the trials that are being done in the United States, they have to be registered at the National Institute of Health. Even for coronavirus, you can go on there and say, what are the coronavirus studies that are going on? So I checked last night, and there are 346,767 clinical trials in 50 states and in 216 countries that are registered on this website. And it's interesting because you go into this website and you say, okay, I only want studies for leiomyosarcoma. So you put that in there, and you say, okay, I want only studies in California. So then, you know, it lists everything that that you're qualified for. So this is the best place to go. You just have to type clinicaltrials.gov. But Sharon's website is also great because she has all the LMS studies that are on. So, you know, you can also, for leiomyosarcoma, you can go to Sharon's website, to the LMSDR website, and then they give you all the available studies that are focused on leiomyosarcoma and sarcomas. So these are the ways that you can go into these trials. So, this is all I have for presentation. I wanted to have enough time at the end. You know, we have 30 minutes and we can either, let me see. So Sharon, should I go through the chat questions?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So
for me.
okay. So one question is, how long does it take for cell study to phase 3? So when they do the cell studies, usually it takes about 10 years. So unless if you get really good results from cell studies that you can move it quickly to phase 3, but it usually takes about 8 to 10 years to go from cell studies to phase 3. Sharon is asking, what is a basket trial? Basket trial is when it's a sort of like a phase 2 study. But what they're doing is they are testing multiple types of sarcomas, for example. So we had a basket trial for immunotherapy and for sarcomas. So they listed several different kinds of sarcomas. My cats are fighting, sorry. Okay, so they have several different types of sarcomas. For example, they had pleomorphic sarcoma, they had leiomyosarcoma, they had dedifferentiated liposarcoma, and each group had 20 slots available, and then they used the drug for these patients. This is called a basket trial, where you're basketing a bunch of types of sarcomas, and you're giving the same drug to them. And then at the end, you figure out, oh, this it worked in this type of sarcoma, but it didn't work in the other type of sarcoma, right? So that's a basket trial when you're trying to test multiple different types of tumors.
Okay. If other people have questions, just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. Yeah. And while people are doing that, I was interested in what trials you have that an LMS patient might be eligible for at Stanford.
Yeah, so right now we have an andlotinib trial, which is a small molecule. It's a pill. It's a targeted therapy. And this drug is tested in leiomyosarcoma, but is placebo controlled, right? So Dr. Bowie has opened this study because we saw some good results with Votrient, with pazopanib. And that's why this is a large company study where we're comparing it to placebo. Now, patients who've had prior Votrient do not qualify for that study. And we did the study in synovial sarcoma, and leiomyosarcoma, and in alveolar soft part sarcoma. So that's one study that we have as a phase 3 placebo. The other...
I need to mute people, and then... hang on a moment. I'm going to mute everybody, and then just unmute yourself if you're going to ask a question. Okay, great. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay, so that's one study we have. We have an immunotherapy study.
Go again. I think Charles, you may have a lot of background noise. Can you mute yourself until you're ready to ask a question? Or I'll mute you. 1 minute.
Okay, it's better.
Okay, great, thanks.
So we have another study that's immunotherapy study. There was, which is with a drug called Yervoy and Opdivo. And these two drugs stimulate your immune system to fight the cancer cell. Initially, in a uterine leiomyosarcoma, Dr. George did a study where she gave one patient with a certain mutation, it's called the P10 mutation, with uterine leiomyosarcoma. She gave that person immunotherapy, and she figured out why it didn't work for that patient. So now a lot of us are doing genetic testing on the tumor to make sure that patients don't have that P10 mutation, because usually immunotherapy doesn't work for that type of patient. But we've seen a lot of leiomyosarcomas respond to immunotherapy. And there's been multiple studies published over the past 2-3 years for immunotherapy drugs. These drugs are approved for lung cancer. They do miracles. They're approved for kidney cancer. And interestingly, the two guys that developed these two drugs got the Nobel Prize for medicine about a year ago. So it's a very interesting drug in that it goes into your system intravenously, and it stimulates your immune system to kill the cancer cells. What is interesting is that we don't know how effective these immunotherapy drugs are by themselves. So recently we did a couple of cryoablation. I know Dr. Z talked to you about, cryoablation, which is freezing of some of the tumors. So if you freeze some of the tumors, the dead cancer cells spill into the blood, and you're giving the immunotherapy, and then the immunotherapy stimulates your immune system, and your immune system comes in and sees these dead cancer cells in the blood, and they say, what's going on? What are these things? And they develop an immunity to it, and your immune system then kills the cancer cells. So that's one of the studies we have now. We have 23 patients out of the 30 that were allowed. And this, the company Bristol Myers Squibb actually allowed us to do this study. They're giving us the drugs for free. So patients get every 3 weeks, they get their immunotherapy drug. And one time between the first and the second dose, they get a procedure. The procedure is very simple. It's not surgery. They put a needle, just like you're getting a biopsy of a lung tumor, right? They put a needle through the chest, they biopsy the tumor, and of course you're out, you're kind of numb, and you're not feeling it. And then they freeze at the end of the needle. There's a freezing device. It freezes the tumor, and the tumor cells, the dead ones spill into the blood. So that's one of the studies we have, and it's for all sarcomas, not just for leiomyosarcoma. But over the past 3 years, I've treated some leiomyosarcomas and other sarcomas with immunotherapy. And one of the good things is 50% of the time insurance approves it, the drugs, if you're not on a clinical trial. But 50% of the time they don't, and Medicare doesn't, because it's not approved by the FDA for sarcoma yet. So we've been working with the drug company, and they will give us the drugs for free. So, that's even outside of a clinical trial. That's called a compassionate use. So, the drug company is being compassionate in terms of giving us the drugs for free so we can give it to patients who don't have it. And these are only for drugs that are approved by the FDA. So that's the other study that we have. And then multiple other things that we have. I forgot to put the list of the studies on the slides, so sorry about that. But so the anlotinib study, the immunotherapy study, and we have a study by Dr. Van Tine over at Washington University. And his study is really interesting. Actually, I have several leiomyosarcoma patients on this study. And it's giving gemcitabine and taxotere, which all of you guys are familiar with a new drug that he's been working on very hard to cut the metabolism of the tumor. So what it does is that it deprives the body of arginine, which is an amino acid that is essential for the tumor growth, right? So it gives you these injections. We give these once a week injections, and then you also get your chemotherapy, which is gemcitabine and taxotere. And we give half of the doses of chemotherapy, because if you deprive the tumor of arginine, they can't grow anyway. They can't divide. So on top of that, you're giving them chemotherapy. I have one patient so far that has, we have several patients. Dr. Van Tine has several patients with leiomyosarcoma that have had complete responses.
Wow.
And and one of my patients had a complete response. She was supposed to be on this call, but I don't see her. But so, the side effects from that injection is basically low blood counts. The other side effects are from the chemotherapy that you normally get anyway. But the low blood counts, and that's why we had to cut down the chemotherapy dose. So the company that makes this drug is called Polaris, and Polaris is coming in with a phase 3 study where half of the patients will just get gemcitabine taxotere, the other half will get gemcitabine taxotere and this ADI drug. And Dr. Van Tine has already finished with the 70, 80 patients that he wanted. So now he's opening the study for Ewing sarcoma and osteosarcoma. So that's another drug that we need to look forward to when it kind of comes into phase 3 studies. Because that phase 3 study, you're already getting the standard chemotherapy. Well, you may be lucky to get the other drug as well. So those are the most popular studies that we have at Stanford right now that leiomyosarcoma patients will qualify for. And we have several phase 3 studies.
Those are exciting.
Phase 1 studies.
Those are really exciting. Any questions?
Yeah, Dr. Ganjoo and Sharon, thank you. This is absolutely amazing, and you're giving me hope. So I have two questions. One, it seems like these new trials and this whole PARP inhibitor is more for folks who have genetic mutations. Can you speak to the opportunities for those who've had tumors with no genetic mutations? And you talked about the risks on one of your slides, but I guess I'm also hearing that there's, these trials are giving us hope as well, and that there are more treatment options. So I guess that's the bright spot in all of this.
I see. Okay, yeah. So we, the National Cancer Institute have had this study for uterine leiomyosarcoma patients, and they were giving, and we had it open at our study. We had several patients on the study as well, but the study's closed now because they were able to complete the study. So it was a phase 2 study. Patients were getting temozolomide or Temodar, which is a pill that is a chemotherapy pill that I give to a lot of my uterine leiomyosarcomas, but they were also getting olaparib, which is the PARP inhibitor, so together. And they're analyzing the data now because they completed accrual. So we'll see. We didn't require patients to have any genetic mutations for that. So hopefully soon, when the study is all evaluated and done, we can see how many patients who didn't have a genetic mutation responded and how many patients didn't. So we have I have a leiomyosarcoma patient that, give chemotherapy to, everything to, but didn't work. And then finally, after doing the genetic testing, we figured out that she did have the mutation that PARP inhibitor can help, and I just got the results of her CT scan just a couple of days ago, and she's responding, which is amazing because she never responded to anything else, and the tumors are shrinking, and it's a pill. It's just a pill. So it's amazing that some of these drugs do work for some patients. But please remember, guys, you go to your doctor, oncologist, you ask for genetic testing on your tumor sample. There's several companies that do that. One of them is Foundation Medicine. The other one is Tempus. There's several companies and what the genetic testing is, they're not checking your genetic material. They're checking the tumor genetic material. So they're getting your tumor sample from your prior biopsy. They don't have to do another biopsy. They get the tumor sample from wherever you had the biopsy. The pathologist gives them a little tiny block, and they take it to their lab, they extract the RNA and they extract the DNA, and they analyze it to see what mutations the tumor has, right? Does it have a deletion? Does a part of the gene gone, or is part of the gene doubled, or is it mutated, changed, or is one of the gene jumping from one of the chromosomes to the other chromosome on the tumor? So these things are really important because nowadays we're sometimes I just even forget about chemotherapy because, as you know, chemotherapy is just killing cancer cells that are dividing. And if you have a slow growing tumor, chemotherapy doesn't work for that. So these are chemicals that are not targeting anything. They're just targeting the dividing cells, the chromosomes that are, when the cancer cells divide, one becomes 2, 2 becomes 4. So it attacks the DNA. So chemotherapy is basically just killing fast growing cells. That's why you lose your hair, because your hair is fast growing. That's why some patients lose their eyebrows. So these kind of chemotherapies are kind of becoming a little old news. And now we're doing targeted therapies to target that gene mutation that's actually causing the tumor to grow. So that's targeted therapy. And then the immunotherapy is basically stimulating your immune system to kill the cancer cells. So there are 3 things that we can do: chemotherapy, targeted therapy, immunotherapy. But please have your tumor tested. And remember, a lot of these companies, Foundation Medicine, Tempus, they do financial checking on your application. So all my nurses, when they call patients to get their okay to send the sample, there's an application that we fill out for the patient that says, here's how much the patient makes, here's how much insurance or medical costs the patient has, here's how many kids they have in college. So we put that all in there, and the company reviews it. They don't need your tax returns. They don't need any of that. They review it and they say, okay, I'm going to give this patient 100% off on this testing. So you get it for free, because a lot of the times insurance companies don't pay for it. I've had some patients who get 80% off. Of course, if you're a millionaire, they will say, okay, just go ahead and pay your $3,000 for this test, So those are the things that you should always do. Genetic testing of your tumor is extremely important. I see Kathleen now on the, she told me I can call her out. So Kathleen is my star patient who had a complete response to this Dr. Van Tyne's Washington University study. She's doing wonderful. Even her hair is growing back because she finished her gemcitabine taxotere with the injections that starved the tumor. And now she's only on the injections. She's done with her chemotherapy. So I wanted her to just introduce herself. Kathleen, unmute yourself.
Hi, Kathleen.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. No, I've been on this study. I did the paperwork in August and started the study in September at Stanford. And it's been quite a journey, but it's, as Dr. Ganjoo was talking, it's really a lot of communication with the doctor. And that was something I didn't really know going into it. I decided to join the trial because Gemtax was the next drug in my lineup that I was going to do. And I knew that I was going to do Gemtax. And I said, oh, well, I'm getting these shots of this ADI. Why not, get the increased shots to see if it really does make a difference? And I'm kind of helping maybe find a cure with this by doing the ADI injections along with the Gemtax. So that's why I decided to do the study. And Stanford, with traffic before COVID, was about an hour and a half or more one way for me. So I was going down there weekly. I just kind of called it my Stanford Thursdays and spending the whole day at Stanford. So it is a time commitment to be in these trials. But I was also, working with Dr. Ganjoo, able to do some things closer to home if I needed to do additional blood draws during the week or a CT scan. So there are certain things that can be done closer to home depending on the study and what the study allows. So I just wanted people to know that, because unfortunately these trials, this one's offered at 3 places around the country. So if you find a trial that you think you're a fit for, it is a commitment to make the travel, but you are allowed to, depending on the study, to do things closer to home. And another huge benefit for me of being in this study was really being under that microscope and really being closely monitored on all of my side effects and all of my health, and having a navigator dedicated to sarcomas, a research coordinator. And my research coordinator has just been amazing, and I can go to her with any kinds of questions, and she makes all my appointments for all of my treatment at Stanford and gets my paperwork done for scans, and for other doctors I want to see at Stanford, she's there to really help with that. So it's just really having that communication with the doctor and also the research coordinator. And then one thing that Dr. Ganjoo talked about is that if you decide to enroll in a trial, really have all of your medical history kind of in one place on one sheet. Stanford had a lot of mine, but when I went in to do that initial appointment and trial paperwork, I wish I had taken more with me, because they were asking me about dates of when I had this surgery or that treatment. I'm like, oh, I think it's then. It's like, oh, I should have brought all my files with me. I really prepared more of that to have it all in one place when I went for that appointment. We got it all done, but it would have been a lot quicker process for everyone if I had really had that more than just in my mind, had my files with me. And really the other thing is I just kind of dedicated every Thursday to this because I really kind of never knew how long I was going to be there. But part of that was my blood work. But I just got into that mindset of really making this work and being committed to it and really having that open communication with Dr. Ganjoo and the research coordinator.
Well, we're thrilled about your results, Kathleen. Yay. Keep us informed.
Okay.
Just to be fair, another one of my patients is on the call. I'm not going to name her because I didn't check with her before. She was also on this trial, but after one dose, she had really severely low blood counts. So that's why we do these trials, because we're trying to figure out, does it have side effects? Does it not have side effects? So after one dose, she had such drop in her blood counts that it was just unheard of. So she had to be off study, but which means that she came off study because of that. And these kind of things happen, and that's why we do the trials, and that's why we monitor patients closely. So just to be fair, just not to have all the positives, but also the negatives. So, but we monitored her closely, if the patients need blood transfusions, they get it, but she's off study, and hopefully we'll be able to kind of come up with a different plan for her. But for now, thank you, Kathleen, and also my other patient, which I'm not naming, but so what other questions? Let's see.
Have anything else from the chat?
Have they found targeted therapy for TP53? That's from Mary. And unfortunately, no. There are a couple of clinical trials now that are ongoing that are testing that. Unfortunately, a lot of sarcoma patients have this mutation when we check their genetic mutation of the tumor, which is TP53, which is a tumor suppressor gene. So imagine if you don't have a good tumor suppressor gene in your body, you can't suppress the growth of the tumors. But there's several clinical trials now that are testing new drugs for that to change that mutation or target that mutation, but none have been successful yet, and they're still ongoing. So that was one of the questions. The other thing I was going to talk to you guys about was we are now, Sharon was really instrumental to help Dr. Matt Van der Rijn, help us collect blood samples from leiomyosarcoma patients to see whether or not there is any circulating tumor DNA, which means that if you have a tumor, the tumor DNA, the tumor cells kind of get into the bloodstream and the cells lyse open, and then the DNA that's inside the tumor gets into your bloodstream. We call that liquid biopsy. So we get a blood test and we look in there to see whether we see circulating tumor DNA. It's really interesting because some patients have surgery, right? You do the surgery and you're done, and we get CT scans. So now we're doing this blood test to see whether or not we can monitor the tumor coming back. First time that we do a CT scan after surgery, it may be negative. The CT scan requires millions of cells, cancer cells, to show up as a dot on the CT scan. But if you do a liquid biopsy or a blood test, you can actually see this DNA floating around. And it's not normal to have a DNA floating around. There is a company that I've started working with over the past 6 months. The company's called Signatera. And one of our fellows that I trained actually is running that company. So he developed this test where it's a liquid biopsy, and they look in the blood to see where there is DNA. Now, Matt Van der Rijn, our pathologist, does that as a research procedure. And as a research, when you do research like this, we're not allowed to tell the patients what we see because it's not approved. Otherwise, the lab is not approved by the FDA. So we can't tell you. So some patients will say, did you see anything in my blood? I can't share that results with you because we don't know if we see something, is it truly something or not? So the patient will get worried, and then we'll get all, patient gets upset. But this company has actually developed a commercial test, which basically means you give a blood sample. The initial time takes 30 days because the company gets your tumor sample from the lab. They look and see, okay, this is what the mutations this tumor has. So they go and look in the blood for that mutation. So I've been doing a lot of these tests on my patients, and I've noticed before the CT scan shows anything, the blood turns positive, right? So the blood turns positive, and I know there is something there. I know the cancer's coming back. But then 3 months later is when the CT scan shows something. So these are all advances that we're kind of testing. And the test is not FDA approved yet. They're asking FDA for approval for colon cancer, but it's not approved yet. So we use it with caution. But if you have the positive cells in your blood, then you have cancer somewhere. But again, because it's not approved, we have to allow the patients, let the patients know. But at least we get the results in real time, so and we can report the results to you, even though it's not FDA approved. It's not research, right? So we can report the results to you. That company also has some financial help. And I don't know how much the tests are, but they also run financial stuff, and then they help. And they give us sample, boxes for free because we're collecting data to see whether or not it helps my patients. So that's another thing that we're doing to figure out, can we detect the tumor early? And it's interesting because I've seen when patients get treatment, for example, if they have a lot of tumor in their blood, and we give them chemotherapy and you test them again, you see the level goes really low. So it's interesting, but these are still kind of all preliminary data.
We have a question from Charles on the chat, and he says, could CRISPR-9 repair a damaged TP53 gene defect?
So that's in the works, but unknown yet. So more research needs to be done for that.
There's another question from Paula. Should every tumor be tested? And I don't know if she means every metastasis or every primary tumor, but maybe you could speak to both.
Yes, so so when the patient is diagnosed, right, if they have surgery and there's no cancer left, then we can say, well, maybe we shouldn't test this tumor now because we're not going to give chemotherapy or targeted therapy to the patient anyway. So what's the point of doing it now? Versus if in 3 years from now it comes back, you test it then. You don't test the primary tumor 3 years later. You test the new biopsy 3 years later, because tumors continue to mutate. And also the science of all this testing is improving by the month. So if now you have uterine leiomyosarcoma and you had surgery and it was removed, and we're not recommending chemotherapy, you leave it alone, and then you continue follow-up. And if at 3-4 years later it comes back, then you biopsy the tumor, and that's the biopsy sample you send for genetic testing.
Got it. Great.
Yeah, but you don't need to biopsy every tumor if they come back within 6 months, because they usually don't mutate that fast. And but if it's 3 years later, yes, you need to get the new biopsy.
So 2 years later, I just had surgery. So I should have the genomic testing done again?
So tell me a little bit about it. So you had the testing 2 years ago, you had the surgery 2 years ago, and now the cancer came back?
2.5 years ago, I had hysterectomy. The tumor was tested, the genomics testing was done. Then 8 months later, I got another tumor, and to my knowledge, that was not tested.
Yes, so that's because within eight months or so it came back, it's most likely the same tumor. So if it comes back like 3-4 years later, then it may be a new mutation, and that's when you would test it again.
It came back this past June, and I just had surgery this Wednesday.
They should check it if it's been years. If it's been years apart, then they should check the genetic testing as well.
I asked for that, and I didn't know if I asked the right question or not.
Yes.
I don't know if it should be, but I haven't seen my sarcoma doctor yet, and she said we'll talk about it after surgery.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, sure. And then there's another question from Mary. Is it safe to biopsy a tumor? Interesting question. Very, very good. Okay. So we usually are very careful with biopsying tumors in the abdomen because it's very easy to seed in the abdomen. Once it seeds in the abdomen, it's very difficult to treat it because it spreads, it goes into the fluid, it goes into the peritoneum, and it's extremely difficult to cure at that time. So biopsying intra-abdominal tumors, not so good. There's a big risk. But if the tumor is large and it's right underneath the abdominal wall, that's easier to biopsy because you go in and then you biopsy, you come out. Usually it doesn't seed. But tumors in the abdomen, very important not to do that. If they're in the retroperitoneum, which is in the back of your abdomen, they can go from the back with a needle in the back and biopsy it. So that's usually safe. Some of the other risks are bleeding, of course. So some tumors are heavily friable, so they can bleed. As soon as you put the needle in it, it can bleed. So that's also very bad because if it bleeds, all the cancer cells get into the abdomen. Oh, Sharon, I forgot to tell you guys about the new study that we're opening at Stanford for Leiomyosarcoma. I totally forgot about that because it's not open yet. So hopefully in a couple of months, we'll have this study open. It's called HIPEC, which basically is we heat the chemotherapy and we put it in the abdomen. And then once it kind of soaks the abdomen and then we wash it out. And that's for patients who've had uterine leiomyosarcoma in the past, and they had surgery, but it came back in the abdomen, nowhere else. So what we're doing is my surgeon, Dr. Bern Lee, who we just hired a year ago from Southern California, we opened the abdomen. Dr. Lee takes all the tumor that he can see out, but you know there's going to be microscopic cells. So he closes the abdomen and then puts 2 drains in the abdomen. And then we have a device where it heats the gemcitabine chemotherapy. And then while you're in the operating room, they put the chemotherapy into your abdominal cavity. And then they swish you around, it kind of goes everywhere. And then they wash it out after about an hour. They wash it and take it out. And then we hope that with giving the chemotherapy inside the abdomen, it can get those very last microscopic cells. This procedure has been very effective for ovarian cancer, not sarcoma, but ovarian cancer. And it's been used for a very long time, like for about 20 years. Now, a couple of surgeons in Greece gave this to gemcitabine specifically to pancreatic cancer patients, and they had some good results, delaying the recurrence of the tumor. So that's why we developed this study for what's called HIPEC study for patients with uterine leiomyosarcoma.
Would it be available for people who had their tumor morcellated and they're still technically stage 1?
Not yet. We have to have some kind of disease, the recurrence.
Okay.
So if you even have a 1 centimeter recurrence in the abdomen, you qualify because we take the patient and we have to clean them out and, by surgery, and then you infuse everything in. Yes, definitely.
Okay. So we have another question. What are the side effects of heated chemo?
Yeah, so the heated chemotherapy, as I was saying, it was used for, it has been used for ovarian cancer. And they use cisplatin chemotherapy. And the gemcitabine one has only been used in Greece. So we're the first center that's going to do this for gemcitabine for any kind of cancer. Irritation, chemotherapy can irritate the internal organs. So we're anticipating there may be some abdominal pain. There may be a little bit of nausea. There may be some fevers because you're putting the drug in the abdomen. Patients with ovarian cancer do very well with the cisplatin, heated cisplatin. They do well. They're just having a little bit of abdominal pain, a little bit of nausea, but not any issues because it doesn't get absorbed systemically. So normally we don't think you're going to get liver problems or blood count problems, but we watch that very carefully.
Okay, great. Let's see. I think there's some other chat questions. Let's see.
Oh, are no FDA or trial drugs available under the right to try? No trial drugs are right to try. I'm not sure what that means. Charles, what does that mean?
You want to unmute yourself, Charles?
Oh, I was muted. Oh.
No.
Oh, can I ask a quick question while we're waiting?
Charles is trying to unmute himself, but he's not unmuted.
Oh.
So, right to try. Oh, there he is. Go ahead, Charles.
Are non-FDA approved drugs available for use of a right to try, especially for non-sarcoma center?
Yes, yes, I understand what you're saying. Okay. All right. So we do have drugs that are not FDA approved that we may be able to get from the FDA. We have to file an application. Remember, I told you guys about investigational new drug application. Basically, I would have to do that. I fill out an application and say, this drug is not in any clinical trial right now, but the previous clinical trial was promising. So I want to give this drug to my patient. So I have to write a letter to the FDA describing the patient's chemotherapies and prior things and say why I want to use this drug. And then I give that to the FDA. The FDA looks at it and says, okay, I allow you to get this drug from the company if the company gives it to you. So then the company gives it to me and then I give it to the patient. But the FDA wants me to give updates periodically. And we just did that for another patient of mine about 3 months or so ago. She wanted to use an immunotherapy drug that was been tested in phase 1 study and some phase 2, but it's not approved yet. So I was able to get that drug for her. So that's, I guess you would call that right to try. Yes, we can do it, but there's some work that needs to be done from the physician, from the oncologist. We just have to agree. The FDA has to agree that, okay, this investigator knows how to monitor the patients, make sure you don't, harm the patient and all those other things. So yes, we can do that.
Okay, we've got a great question here from Jean. Will our oncologists know the best performing clinical trials for our type of LMS and be able to give us a referral, or do we have to do our own research?
Good question.
So interesting question. I think all of the oncologists that are general oncologists and not a sarcoma specialist are not going to know exactly what trials are available. And the problem with it is sometimes they don't have time to look for every patient to say, this is this study, this is that study, and they don't know the details of this study. So I think you have to be your own advocate here. You have to look for different trials. You have a great patient advocacy group here with Sharon, and you have a good resource, but you have to do your own research because a lot of the doctors, general oncologists, don't know, and there are a lot of and then they don't have the time. The other thing I was going to say, and I completely forgot, was Kaiser patients. We are allowed to treat Kaiser patients on clinical trials, but we have to get approval. So I have a lot of patients that are Kaiser patients, and I tell them that we have this trial and this trial that's not available at Kaiser, and we get approval from Kaiser. Now, the way that Kaiser approves it is all of the tests and everything that's standard of care to be done at Kaiser, and just the research stuff to be done at the university.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so just because you have Kaiser doesn't mean you can't get on our clinical trials. I just wanted to give that.
Yay, that's good news. So Paula asked, and it kind of goes into the next question, at what point should anyone consider joining a clinical trial? And Cindy asked, do you have to exhaust all other options before going into a clinical trial?
Okay, so answering Cindy first, there is no reason for you to exhaust all your options before you go to clinical trial, because sometimes what happens is you do all of this available stuff, and then at the end, the cancer is progressively getting bigger, and you don't have a good performance status, which means that you're not able to get out of bed. And if that happens, you lose a lot of weight, and your capability of taking care of yourself is not good. Anytime we do a clinical trial, patient has to be able to walk to clinic, take care of herself at home, and be healthy enough. So if you exhaust all of your options and all of the options that you exhausted were not going to be that effective anyway, and your tumor continues to grow, then you don't qualify for clinical trial at the end of the day because you're not healthy enough. And you have to be healthy because we don't want the clinical trial drug to cause more damage to you and cause more harm in terms of quality of life and those kind of things. So you have to have a reasonable quality of life and reasonably be able to take care of yourself to be able to get on clinical trials. So going back to Paula, if there is a promising clinical trial, if the doctor says, well, I have this drug that's approved, but there is only 20% chance of it working, and there's 80% chance it's not going to work, then you say, well, let me try other clinical trials to see, because this approved drug is always available to me. But this clinical trial is going to run for a year and it's going to be done after that, and I can't get to that drug anymore. So then you say, if this clinical trial is promising, then I'll do this trial first. If it doesn't work, fine. It doesn't work, so I go to my standard drug. But you don't want to exhaust everything if everything is not good. If I had a drug that cured 90% of leiomyosarcoma patients, then there's no reason for you to go on a clinical trial. You do the drug and 90% chance you're cured. But we don't have anything like that for leiomyosarcoma, unfortunately, right now. So that's why you always should consider clinical trials when you're getting treatment for leiomyosarcoma.
A good point. And sometimes if you've had a certain drug already, you don't qualify for the trial because it's part of the trial drug. So you have to look ahead. So if you are just starting doxorubicin, you might look at trials that have doxorubicin plus another chemo, or look at your options that way.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
I have
okay, go ahead.
Yes, so I have two questions. When you were talking about the heated chemotherapy for patients that have already been on gemcitabine, but maybe it didn't work, so in my case it didn't work and I am on a clinical trial now, if the clinical trial stops working, would that be a viable thing? Could I go back on gemcitabine? Would that make a difference that it would be heated?
So basically, there are two things that are important for clinical trials. There is one part of we always write a protocol, which means that this is the document that we're going to go by for this clinical trial. In the document, it says, here's the inclusion criteria, here's the exclusion criteria. So inclusion criteria, every patient has to meet that criteria. For example, for this heated chemotherapy trial, you're not supposed to have prior gemcitabine.
Okay.
You're not supposed to have prior dacarbazine, because the way we designed the study was, okay, patients will have a recurrence after surgery. They're going to get this surgery, and then they're going to get the heated gemcitabine. And once they recover, we're going to give 6 cycles of standard chemotherapy, which is dacarbazine. So in that protocol, we mentioned that patients who've had prior gemcitabine or dacarbazine do not qualify. So there are certain things, and that's why Sharon was mentioning that, because if you exhaust all your options, then you may not even qualify for the trial, because some of those drugs we're using in the clinical trial.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you. And then I have one other question. I'm sorry, I missed the first part of this. With the time change, I forgot. But I'm on a clinical trial that's working very well right now. It's a Vulamap given every 2 weeks, and it's telazoporoid. Am I pronouncing it correct?
Yes.
Yeah, that I take every day. So it started working right away. I've been on it 2 years, and for a year I've been without disease. So, of course, they have no idea how much longer this is going to work. But let's say that a few months down the road it does stop working, then can I just go on? They had said to me, well, maybe we'd look at standard chemotherapy if and when it stopped working. But I would rather go on another clinical trial. Is that viable in your mind, to then find a different clinical trial?
Yes. Patients patients can go through different clinical trials throughout the treatment. Once you're on a clinical trial, if you're off of it, then you can go to the next clinical trial. You can't be on 2 clinical trials.
Right. No. Right.
But yes, and based on my experience, and patients who respond to nivolumab immunotherapy have a long response. I have several patients that have been on nivolumab. They're still getting it once a month. And they've had remission that lasted 3 to 4 years, and they're still in remission. One of the things that you can particularly do if it stops working, you can go off the clinical trial and you can do the cryoablation, which is the freezing technique, and it makes the nivolumab work better. And one of my patients that's been on nivolumab for 3 years now, in the middle of it, we saw this little tumor grow in the lungs. We went in there and froze the tumor and it went away. So a year later, he's still on the nivolumab. So there's a lot of different things you can do that you can, I mean, if immunotherapy works for you, you have to milk it, which means you have to be on it and you kind of add other things to it to make it work. That's great. Okay. I'm really happy for you. That's amazing.
Yes, thanks.
So Jennifer Russell has a question that just leads right into that. If you're successful on a drug in a trial, are you allowed to continue it after the trial closes?
Yes, so a lot of the trials will say, okay, I'm going to give this drug to you for 2 years. There are two things that could happen. The trial closes and they're analyzing their data before they give it to the FDA. During that time, your oncologist may be able to get the drug on compassionate use from the same company. And once the FDA approves it, then you're done. FDA approves it, you can get it with any oncologist that you want to get it. So usually they allow you to continue off the trial. That's the majority of the cases.
That's great. Okay, any more questions? We're running out of time. Mary, does cryoablation work on liver mets?
This Mary has really good questions. We have liver is one of the areas that it's a little bit tough to get cryoablation done for, because it's sort of as like a sanctuary site from cryoablation. But we do high frequency ablation for liver. So we don't do cryoablation because we don't know how much damage to the liver it can cause. So we do radiofrequency ablation for the liver. And that may give us the same response as cryoablation.
That's what I was thinking. Okay, yeah. Great. That was a question for Dr. Z.
Yeah.
Any other questions, folks? Okay, well, Dr. Ganjoo, I can't thank you enough. I learned a ton. Yay, everybody. Yay. I learned a ton. So this is recorded and it'll help other people down the road as well. But I just want to thank you so much. You're getting kudos on the chat right now.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm seeing some of my patients in here. They're so cute. I'm saying, hello, hi.
Yeah, we know them all.
Yeah, I know them all. Well,
yeah,
good to see you guys. Good to see you guys. Please let me know if you have any other questions later on. Sharon can find me anywhere. So, and I'm happy to do this again. And next time I can just talk about uterine leiomyosarcoma.
All right. And you guys could write me your questions and I'll get them to Dr. Ganjoo and back to you on the Facebook group.
Okay. All right.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.